The pack laughed when her name was called. Not a polite laugh. Not the kind that dies quickly out of embarrassment or decorum. This was the full-throated, bone-deep laughter of people who have never once considered that they might be wrong about something, and have no reason to start now. It started at the front, where the betas sat with their polished boots and their ranking medals catching the afternoon light. Then it rolled backward through the courtyard like a wave, picking up volume as it went, through the ranked wolves, through the lower bloods, all the way to the outer ring where the servants pressed together near the stone walls, eyes down, trying to be invisible. Trying to be exactly what she had been for 6 years. Her name was Sarah. And she was standing in the center of the trial courtyard in the same gray linen dress she'd worn to scrub the east corridor that morning. She hadn't changed. There hadn't been time. The summons had come while her hands were still wet, a folded piece of parchment pressed into her palm by a guard who hadn't even looked at her face when he delivered it. Report to the trial grounds at midday. By order of the Alpha King. She'd read it 3 times, standing in the corridor with soapy water dripping from her fingers onto the stone floor. Then she'd gone. Because you didn't refuse an order from Kale Draven. Not if you wanted to keep breathing. The trial of the open court happened once every 5 years. Every wolf in the Draven pack, regardless of rank, bloodline, or status, was theoretically eligible to compete. That was the law. It had been the law for 4 generations, written into the pack charter by Kale's great-grandmother, a woman whose name the history books recorded but whose face had been deliberately excluded from every portrait in the Great Hall. Theoretically eligible. In practice, the trial was a showcase for betas and high bloods. A performance of dominance dressed up as democracy. The Omegas who were occasionally called, and it happened, rarely, usually as some administrative error, withdrew immediately. They cited illness. Family obligation. They found ways to remove themselves from the equation before the actual competition began, because everyone understood the unspoken rule. Omegas did not compete in the open court trial. Omegas served the wolves who did. Sarah had understood this rule better than most. She'd watched 2 trials from the servants' corridor, pressed against the wall with a tray of water flags, watching ranked wolves throw each other across the arena sand while the crowd roared. She'd noted the patterns. The techniques. The mistakes. She'd done it the way she did everything, quietly, carefully, filing information away in the back of her mind where no one could see it and no one could take it. She'd had no idea she was preparing for anything. Until today. The laughter was still going when Alpha King Kale Draven descended the steps from the royal platform. He was exactly what people said he was, which was the first and possibly only uncomplicated thing about him. Tall. Broad. The kind of physically imposing that felt less like genetics and more like a deliberate warning from the universe. His dark hair was pulled back. His jaw was set in the particular configuration that his court had learned to read as I have made a decision and the decision is not open for discussion. He did not smile at the laughter. He did not frown at it either. He walked to the center of the courtyard and stood 3 feet from Sarah and looked at her with eyes the color of deep winter, gray-blue, depthless, giving nothing, and said nothing for a long moment. Sarah looked back at him. This was, apparently, the wrong thing to do. She heard the shift in the crowd even through the dying laughter, a sharp intake of breath, a sudden stillness. Omegas didn't hold eye contact with the Alpha King. Everyone knew that. The reflex to look away was almost biological, bred into pack wolves over centuries of hierarchy. Sarah had worked very hard on that reflex. She'd worked very hard on a lot of things. Seraphine Ashvale, Kale said. His voice carried without effort, the way alpha voices always did, not loud, exactly, but penetrating, the kind of sound that bypassed the ears and registered somewhere deeper. You have been selected to compete in the trial of the open court. I'm aware, Sarah said. Another ripple through the crowd. She heard someone near the beta section say did she just, and then cut themselves off. Kale's expression didn't change. Do you have a question about the terms? No, Sarah said. I have a question about the summons. This time the silence was different. Heavier. The kind of silence that meant everyone had stopped breathing. Ask it, Kale said. Why me? It wasn't a protest. It wasn't fear. She asked it the way she asked everything, directly, without decoration, wanting the actual answer rather than the version people gave when they were trying to manage you. She'd spent 6 years being managed. She was tired of it. Kale looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not warmth, not cruelty, something more complicated than either. Because I wanted to see something, he said. What? Whether you'd run. Sarah looked at him. Looked at the courtyard full of ranked wolves with their crossed arms and their smirking mouths. I looked at the arena sand, pale and smooth and waiting. I didn't run, she said. No, Cale said. You didn't. He turned back to the platform without explaining further. And the trial began. Her first opponent was a beta named Corvin Strauss. He was 17 stone of solid muscle and mild contempt, a ranked fighter who had placed third in the last trial 5 years ago. He had a scar across his left jaw that he'd gotten from a moon bear in the Northern Territories, and he wore it the way men wore things they're proud of, visibly, prominently, as a kind of credential. He looked at Sarah when they called their names and did what everyone else had done. He laughed. Not meanly. That was the thing that surprised her. It wasn't malice, exactly. It was something closer to pity, wearing the wrong clothes. He genuinely thought this was absurd. He genuinely thought someone had made a mistake and he was now obligated to participate in the consequence of that mistake. You can withdraw, he said, quietly enough that the crowd couldn't hear. There was something almost generous in it. I'll tell them you weren't feeling well. No one will say anything. Sarah looked at his left shoulder. Then at his right hip. Then at his jaw, not the scar, the hinge, the way he held it slightly forward when he spoke, the habit of a man who spent a lot of time talking and not enough time guarding. Ready when you are, she said. The match lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She didn't win cleanly. She wasn't supposed to, that would have been suspicious, and Sarah had never been interested in suspicious. She let him push her back twice. She let him think she was struggling with his grip, which was strong but predictable, always the highest pressure on the outside of the wrist, pulling right. She filed that away. She let him feel like he was in control of the match for exactly as long as it took for him to get comfortable. Comfortable wolves made mistakes. When his left shoulder dropped, and it did drop, it always dropped, she'd seen him spar in the yard 3 times over the past year through a laundry window, and it always dropped when he committed to a tackle. She moved. Not dramatically. Not the way fighters moved in stories, all grace and slow motion. She moved the way water moved, finding the gap, filling it, going through rather than against. She used his own momentum to redirect him, her foot behind his heel, her weight through her shoulder, and then Corvin Strauss hit the arena sand with a sound that was half impact and half surprise, and she was standing over him before he'd processed what had happened. The crowd was quiet. This was not the end of the trial. There were more rounds. More opponents. The trial ran until the pool was reduced to the final 2 competitors, who would face each other in front of the full assembly. But this moment, this specific, suspended moment of Corvin Strauss blinking up at the gray sky from the arena floor and Sarah standing with her plain dress and her wet work hands and her absolute stillness, this was the moment that would be talked about later. When the shock settled, the crowd did not cheer. They didn't know what to do with it yet. She beat the second opponent in 6 minutes. Her name was Lisa Crane, a ranked wolf from the southern bloodline who was fast and vicious and who fought with genuine anger rather than contempt, which made her more dangerous than Corvin and also, ultimately, more predictable. Anger had patterns. Anger wanted the same things over and over. She wanted to hurt Sarah specifically, which meant she was thinking about Sarah rather than the match, which meant her peripheral awareness was compromised. Sarah used the left side. The whole time. Third opponent, 8 minutes. A tall beta named Oren who fought methodically, technically, who had clearly studied the trial records and knew what had worked before. She respected him for that. She beat him by doing something that wasn't in the trial records, a joint lock she'd read about in a medical text she'd found in the back of the library 3 years ago while she was supposed to be cleaning the shelves. She'd read it in 20 minutes while no one was watching. She'd practiced it alone in her room for 6 months. She didn't know why. She hadn't known she was preparing. She'd just been restless. Hungry. Filling the time with things that felt like they might matter someday. One day I arrived wearing gray linen. After the 3rd round, the laughter had stopped. After the 4th round, which lasted 11 minutes and which she did not win cleanly, which left her with her lips split and a deep ache in her right ribs that told her something might be cracked, the silence had a different texture. Dense. Uncertain. The crowd was watching her the way people watched something they couldn't categorize, with the particular discomfort of a story that wasn't going the way the story was supposed to go. She could feel Cale watching her from the platform. She didn't look at him. Between the 4th and 5th round she was given water and 10 minutes rest in the preparation alcove off the main courtyard. She sat on the stone bench and pressed her fingers carefully along her ribs and confirmed what she'd suspected: 1 was cracked, maybe 2. Not broken through. Painful but workable. She'd had worse. She'd had worse things that were supposed to be part of normal pack life. That was something she didn't think about directly. She kept it in the same place she kept everything: uncomfortable, stored, catalogued, accessible only when it was useful. Right now it wasn't useful. Right now she needed to breathe slowly and carefully and think about what she knew about Davin Reese, who was the fifth-round opponent and who was waiting somewhere on the other side of the alcove wall. Davin Reese was the current trial favorite. He'd won the last trial. He was a beta prime, the highest non-alpha rank in the pack hierarchy, which meant his wolf instincts were sharper than any of her previous opponents and his strength was in a different category entirely. She'd watched him train twice. Once through the laundry window again. Once by accident, when she'd been carrying supplies through the east yard and had stopped to watch without intending to, standing there with a crate of folded cloth in her arms for 10 minutes before anyone noticed her and told her to move along. She knew 3 things about Davin Reese. 1. He was fast. Faster than she was, by a significant margin. 2. He had never lost, which meant he didn't know how to recover from being behind. 3. His left knee had been damaged 6 years ago in a conflict at the northern border. It had healed. It performed. But under deep lateral pressure, it hesitated, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, before responding. She had 6 minutes of rest left. She breathed. She thought. She decided. She wasn't going to win this round. She was going to lose in a way that told her exactly what she needed to know for the final. She lost to Davin Reese in 14 minutes. He was everything she'd expected: fast, precise, dominant in a way that felt almost physical, like the air around him had a current that pushed against you. He controlled the match from the first 20 seconds and she let him. She offered him just enough resistance to make it look real, pushed into the spaces she needed to test, confirmed what she'd suspected about the knee, noted 2 additional things she hadn't known. He telegraphed direction changes with his left shoulder and he breathed in a specific rhythm before a decisive strike, a half-second inhale that was as readable as a word on a page. She filed it. She stored it. She let him put her on the sand. The crowd reacted. Finally, something they understood. Relief and familiar narrative. The Beta Prime defeating the Omega Servant, order reasserting itself, the story getting back on track. Sarah lay on the arena floor for a moment and looked up at the pale sky and felt the pain in her ribs and thought, with complete clarity, I know exactly how to beat him. She got up. The crowd went quiet again. Not falling, they could process. Getting up like that, with no hurry, no drama, no visible defeat, was something else. The final worked differently. The 2 finalists were given 30 minutes to rest and prepare. Then they would face each other before the full pack assembly, which meant the secondary ranks would be permitted to enter the courtyard grounds, swelling the crowd from a few hundred to several thousand. It was theater as much as competition. The trial champion was announced with ceremony, offered a rank elevation and a seat on the advisory council for the next cycle. In the 20-year history of Kale Draven's reign, no one below Beta had ever reached the final. Sarah sat in the preparation alcove and bound her ribs with a strip torn from the bottom of her dress and thought about power. Not physical power, she'd made her peace with that arithmetic a long time ago. She was smaller than every wolf she'd faced today, and while she was fast and precise and had spent 6 years quietly filling her mind with things she had no apparent reason to know, she was not naturally dominant in the way ranked wolves were. That wasn't something you trained into existence. It was either there or it wasn't. But there were different kinds of power. There was the power you were born into, which the pack hierarchy ran on, bloodline, rank, the density of wolf in your blood determining how much of the world you got to occupy. There was the power you accumulated, which was what the trial was supposed to test: skill, strength, the competitive proof of your right to rise. And then there was the power no one talked about, the kind that didn't have a formal place in the hierarchy. The power of knowing things. Of watching. Of being so thoroughly disregarded for so long that the people around you stopped filtering what they did in front of you, because you didn't count, which meant you saw everything. Sarah had 6 years of everything. She knew which council members took bribes and from which merchants. She knew which beta commanders had falsified their border reports. She knew about the missing grain shipments from the southern stores and the argument 3 months ago between the pack treasurer and the Alpha King's head of intelligence that had been conducted in a room that also contained a servant corridor with imperfect soundproofing. She had never used any of it. She had simply held it. Carried it the way she carried everything, carefully, without knowing when it might matter. She was starting to think it might all be connected. She was starting to think today was not an accident. The doors to the alcove opened. Not a guard. Not a steward with water and a schedule. Cale Draven. He filled the doorway in the way powerful people filled spaces, not through deliberate presence but through some quality that was harder to name, the sense that the room had reorganized itself around him without asking permission. He looked at her sitting on the stone bench with her torn dress and her bound ribs and her completely steady expression, and something moved across his face that might have been surprise, if he'd been anyone else. "You lost the 5th round on purpose," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sarah said. "You needed to test his knee." She looked at him. He'd seen that, then. Or deduced it. "Yes. And now you think you can beat him?" "I know I can beat him." Cale was quiet for a moment. He stepped into the alcove and leaned against the opposite wall with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to make themselves unpredictable by simply not moving. "You've been watching him." "For how long?" 2 years. "You've been watching all of them." Not a question either. She didn't answer. "Why?" he asked. "Before today. Before you had any reason to. Why were you watching ranked fighters train?" This was the real question. She'd known it was coming because it was the question she'd been asking herself for years without arriving at a satisfying answer. Why had she spent her evenings reading military history she had no business reading? Why had she memorized pack law, all 400 pages of it, during the 2 winters when the library went mostly unvisited and no one noticed a servant sitting in the back corner? Why had she filed and stored and catalogued, building something she had no apparent use for? "I don't know," she said, which was the honest answer. "I think you do," Cale said. "Maybe," she said. "But I'm not telling you." The silence held. Then Cale said, "I've been watching you for 3 years." Everything in Sarah went very still. "You made yourself invisible," he said. "You were good at it. But invisible isn't the same as gone, and I notice things that aren't where they're supposed to be." He paused. "You're not where you're supposed to be." "I know," Sarah said. "Do you know why?" She looked at him directly, that thing that kept happening, this involuntary refusal to look away, which she understood was a challenge and couldn't seem to stop doing. "Are you going to tell me?" "Not yet," Cale said. He left. Sarah sat in the alcove and listened to her own heartbeat and thought about the word yet and what it meant that an Alpha King would use it to an Omega servant in a preparation room before a trial final. And then she stopped thinking about it, because she had 45 seconds left of her rest period and she needed to spend it on something useful. She spent it thinking about Davin Reese's knee. 3,000 wolves. That was the approximate count of the full pack assembly, gathered in and around the trial courtyard as the afternoon light began to angle toward gold. Some had been there since the morning rounds. Others had arrived as word spread through the pack compound. Something was happening at the trial. Something that didn't fit. Sarah walked out of the preparation alcove and into the arena and heard the sound change. Not quiet this time. The opposite. 3,000 wolves generate something between a roar and a murmur, the kind of collective noise that has texture, that you feel in your chest. She heard it cycle through phases in the 5 seconds it took her to reach the center line. First the confusion, what is she doing back here? Then the recognition, she made the final, then something more complex and harder to name, a fracture in the crowd along lines she couldn't see but could feel. Not everyone was laughing anymore. Some of them had been watching the earlier rounds. Some of them had seen what she'd done and were doing the math and arriving at an answer that made them uncertain of things they'd been certain about their whole lives. Uncertainty in a crowd was something you could use. Davin Reese stood across the arena and looked at her with absolutely no expression on his face. He was good at that, she'd noted it in the preparation round. He had the kind of control that came from never having been surprised, from spending his whole life in a world that arranged itself according to his position in it. She was about to surprise him. She'd decided on the approach in the alcove. Not a winning approach, not technically, not the cleanest path to putting him on the sand. She could have done it in less time if she were just trying to win. But she needed more than a win. She needed something that couldn't be explained away, couldn't be attributed to luck or fluke or administrative error. She needed something that 3,000 wolves and 1 Alpha King and the entire pack record would have to account for and couldn't. She needed to win in a way that asked a question that no one could ignore. The bell rang. Davin moved. He was, as she'd noted, fast. Faster than should have been possible for someone his size, the beta prime advantage, that concentration of wolf that made the body capable of things outside the normal range. He covered the arena floor in seconds and she moved with him, not away, which surprised him enough that his first strike landed off-center, too far right. She'd stepped into it. Come on, she thought. Come on. I know what you do next. He did it. The rhythm, the inhale, half-beat, the commitment. She was already moving when the strike came, inside his guard before he could adjust, and the next 40 seconds were the most complicated 40 seconds of her life. Pressure, redirect, angle, wait, patience, patience, patience. His knee. The lateral pressure hit it at exactly the right angle and the hesitation was there, that quarter-second stutter, and she used it the way she'd used every other gap in every other opponent, completely. Davin Reese hit the sand. The crowd didn't react. That was the thing. The silence wasn't the shocked silence of before. This was different. 3,000 wolves holding a collective breath, processing something that their entire understanding of the world's order said should not have happened, and not knowing yet what came after. Davin got up. Of course he did. He had too much control not to. He reset his stance and looked at her and something had changed in his expression, not defeat, not yet, but recalibration. He was updating his read on her in real time and she could see it happening and she found it oddly fascinating, like watching someone solve a puzzle they'd been told was unsolvable. Smart, she thought. But not smart enough. The match lasted 22 more minutes. She went down twice. Both times were real. He adjusted faster than she'd expected and his strength, even targeted and controlled, wasn't a category her body had to work to manage. The cracked ribs became relevant. She stopped breathing deeply and started managing her air carefully, a smaller economy of oxygen that she could sustain. She went down the second time and got up and heard something in the crowd change again. Not the silence this time. Something coming up through the silence. A sound she'd never heard before in 6 years of serving this pack. Her name. Not all of them. Not the majority. A handful of voices, scattered and uncertain and quickly swallowed by the pressure of the crowd around them. But real. Present. Her name, spoken as encouragement, which was a thing that she had apparently never experienced before because she felt it hit her somewhere below the ribs that weren't cracked and had to spend a half-second very deliberately not reacting to it. Later, she told herself. File it. Store it. Later. She got up. She went after Davin Reese one more time. The end, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of ending that announced itself. It was two wolves in an arena who had taken each other apart piece by piece for 23 minutes and one of them was finished and the other one was still standing, and the one still standing was Sarah. Davin Reese sat on the arena sand and looked up at her and did something she hadn't expected. He bowed his head. Not submission exactly, he was beta prime, that reflex ran too deep to override entirely. But acknowledgement. Something that said, I see what I'm looking at now. The bell rang. It wasn't a celebration. Not exactly. 3,000 wolves making noise at once in a confined space sounded less like cheering and more like the world deciding something, a collective verdict issuing from somewhere below conscious thought. She heard the fracture lines in it, the difference between the wolves who were erupting with something like awe and the wolves who were erupting with something closer to fury, and she understood that what she'd just done had split the pack along a fault that apparently had always been there, waiting for sufficient pressure. She'd just applied the pressure. She stood in the center of the arena and let it happen around her and kept her face neutral and thought very clearly, now comes the part where it gets dangerous. Cale descended from the platform. He did it the way he'd descended that morning, without hurry, without performance, the walk of someone who had already decided what was going to happen and was simply moving through the time until it did. The crowd quieted in layers as he passed through them, the ancient biological response to alpha presence, like weather settling before a storm. He stopped in front of Sarah. She met his eyes. Seraphine Ashvale, he said. His voice was in its carrying register, the one that reached every wolf in the courtyard. By the law of the open court trial, affirmed by 4 generations of Draven leadership and witnessed by the assembled pack, you are the trial champion. A sound from the crowd. Complex, unresolvable. Under the terms of the trial charter, Cale continued, the champion is entitled to a rank elevation and a seat on the advisory council for the next 5-year cycle. The sound from the crowd sharpened. She heard voices in it now, beta voices, council voices, the specific register of people who have things to lose. She's an Omega. She can't hold council rank. This is unprecedented. The king can't. Additionally, Cale said, and something in his voice shifted slightly, the way the air shifts before lightning, the trial charter, specifically Article 7, Clause 4, which has not been invoked in 60 years, provides that any champion who demonstrates a bloodline qualification during competition may petition for formal bloodline review. The courtyard went absolutely silent. Sarah heard her own heartbeat. She didn't know what her face was doing. She hoped it looked neutral. She hoped it looked like she'd known this was coming. She hadn't known. Not exactly. But she'd suspected. She'd had a theory, and she tried not to hold it too tightly because theories about your own bloodline that would rearrange your entire life were dangerous things to be attached to. The Council of Records will convene within the week, Cale said, still in that carrying voice, talking to the whole crowd now but looking only at her. All documentation pertaining to the bloodline of Seraphine Ashvale will be reviewed under open charter law. He paused. This is not a request. This is a mandate. He turned to face the crowd. The trial has spoken. We honor what it shows us. He turned back to Sarah. And said, quietly, just for her, in a register that didn't carry, that the crowd couldn't have caught, I've been waiting 3 years for that charter clause to have grounds. I need you to give me grounds. Sarah looked at him. You knew, she said. Not an accusation. Just a fact she was processing in real time. I suspected, he said. There's a difference. What did you suspect? That the person scrubbing the East Corridor every morning had no business being in the East Corridor. His eyes were unreadable, but she was starting to read them anyway, starting to parse the code. That someone had gone to considerable lengths to put you there. Who? That, Cale said, is what the Records Council is going to tell us. He offered his hand. She looked at it. She'd been an Omega servant for 6 years. She'd been looked through, talked over, ordered around, and ignored with the thoroughness of people who had never needed to consider that she existed. She'd been handed a summons with wet hands and sent into an arena in a work dress. She'd competed through cracked ribs against ranked wolves twice her weight and won. She took his hand. The crowd erupted again. The Council of Records met 4 days later. Sarah did not attend. That was deliberate. The council needed to work without her presence, which would have become its own argument, because her presence had become a problem for people who had been comfortable with her absence. She spent those 4 days in different quarters. Not the servant wing. She'd been moved to the Eastern Visitor Suites, not the royal level, not officially elevated, but no longer in the basement of the hierarchy. A middle space. A placeholder while the world figured out where to put her. She used the time to read. Not the laundry window, not the servants' corridor, not the 30-second windows she'd had between tasks. Real reading, uninterrupted, in a room with actual light. She worked through the pack law she'd already memorized and found the gaps, the amendments, the exceptions, the clauses that had been altered quietly over decades in ways that consistently narrowed what Omegas were permitted to own, hold, do, and claim. It was a thorough job. Someone had been patient about it. The restrictions didn't look like persecution from the outside. They looked like administrative evolution, practical adjustments, the natural settling of a society around its own structure. But patterns told you things that individual data points didn't. On the 3rd evening, there was a knock at her door. Not a guard. Not a steward. A woman she'd never seen before, which meant nothing. She'd been invisible for 6 years. There were many people she'd never seen. But this woman was old. Older than anyone she'd encountered in the compound. She had the posture of someone who had been important for a very long time and had made peace with no longer needing anyone to know it, and she held herself in the doorway like she was accustomed to deciding whether to enter rooms rather than being permitted to. You read quickly, the woman said, looking at the spread of documents on the table. How do you know that? Sarah asked. Because I sent those documents to your room and they arrived this morning and you're already through the 3rd volume. Sarah looked at her. Who are you? She asked. The woman considered the question with the deliberateness of someone who didn't answer things quickly. My name is Vale. I was the pack archivist for 40 years before I was asked to retire. A pause. I was asked to retire the same year you arrived at this compound. Sarah went very still. I should tell you, Vale said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her, that the Council of Records is going to find something tomorrow. I know what they'll find because I'm the one who hid it. She moved to the table and looked at the documents spread across it. I hid it because it wasn't safe to leave it findable. I made it findable now because, she glanced up at Sarah, because apparently you gave an Alpha King sufficient grounds to invoke Article 7. What did you hide? Sarah asked. Vale looked at her steadily. Your mother's name. And what her name meant to this pack. The room was very quiet. Your mother, Vale said, was Lyra Draven-Ashvile. She was the Alpha King's father's first mate, which would make her, in pack law, the primary bloodline holder of the Draven line before Kale's claim was formalized. She paused. Your mother was removed from the record 17 years ago. The men responsible told the council she had died without issue. She had an issue, Sarah said. Yes, Vale said. She had you. Silence. I'm not Omega, Sarah said. Not a question. Revisiting a suspicion she'd held for years, that the designation hadn't felt right, that something in her blood ran counter to what the hierarchy said she was. Your Omega designation was assigned on arrival, Vale said. It was done quickly, by someone who needed you hidden. The same someone who paid your passage here and bribed a pack administrator to put you in the servant register. Her voice was dry and precise. Someone who could not afford to have the previous Alpha's first mate's daughter walking around with her correct designation. Who? Sarah asked. Vale told her. The name landed in Sarah's chest like a stone into deep water. She'd heard it every week for 6 years. In orders given, in conversations passing through servant corridors, in the carefully maintained record of the pack's administration. It was a council member's name. It was someone who sat in the room that would decide her bloodline tomorrow. The morning of the Records Council hearing, Sarah requested a meeting with Kale. She was given 12 minutes before the session. She used 11 of them. She told him about Vale. About the hidden documentation. About the name. She told him without performance, without drama, moving through the facts in the order that would make them clearest, the way she moved through everything, with the calm of someone who had decided that the most useful thing she could be was honest. Kale listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You've had 11 minutes with this information, he said. What's your recommendation? Sarah looked at him. In the gray morning light he looked tired, which was something she hadn't seen before, the specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has recently received information suggesting the weight is about to shift. Don't arrest him before the session, she said. Why not? Because if you arrest him, the council will spend the next year deciding whether the arrest was legal. The bloodline case becomes secondary. She paused. Let him sit in the room. Let him hear the documentation reviewed. Let the council see his face when Vale presents the original records. She met his eyes. Let the evidence do the work. Kale studied her. You've been doing this for 6 years, he said. Letting evidence do the work. I didn't have another option. You do now. I know, Sarah said. I still think it's the right approach. He was quiet for another moment. Then, all right. The Records Council session lasted 3 hours. Sarah sat in the observer's seat, which was a concession Kale had made to the charter. The party under review was permitted to observe but not to speak unless invited. She sat in her new clothes, which were still plain but were not linen work dress gray, and she watched. The council member's name was Heron Voss. He was 62, white-haired, with the patient demeanor of a man who had navigated a very long career by making himself appear harmless. He'd held his council seat for 30 years. He was considered a moderate, a voice of institutional stability, someone who could be trusted to prioritize the pack's continuity. He sat 3 seats to the left of the archivist's chair. When Vale entered the chamber, he went very still. Sarah watched his face and saw the exact moment he understood that the architecture he'd built 17 years ago, the removed records, the bribed administrator, the Omega designation, all of it, was coming down. He was very controlled about it. She gave him credit for that. He sat straight. He responded to the council's questions with measured language. He raised procedural objections at the correct moments. He was, even now, playing the game he'd spent 30 years getting good at. But he hadn't planned for Vale. The archivist presented the original documentation in the precise, unembellished manner of someone who had spent 40 years presenting documentation, which was to say, clearly, thoroughly, and without mercy. Birth records. Mate designation records. The formal notation of Lyra Draven-Ashvile's status. The subsequent removal, time-stamped, cross-referenced, annotated with a signature that the council could verify against the 30-year record of signatures on file. Heron Voss's signature. The council asked him for his explanation. He gave one. It was a good one. The kind that contained enough true things to be initially plausible, built around the claim that there had been an administrative confusion and that he had been managing a sensitive situation in the interest of pack stability. The council considered it. And then Cale spoke. He didn't speak often during the session, his role was to observe, the charter was clear on that, the Alpha King didn't adjudicate records council matters. But when he spoke, the room focused the way rooms focused when he was speaking. Heron, he said, not Councilmember Voss, just Heron, which was a kind of reduction that everyone in the room felt. You served my father. I did, Voss said. You were present at the recording of his mate designation. Yes. And you are asking this council to believe that your removal of those records 17 years ago was an administrative action. A pause. I am explaining the context. The context, Cale said, is in the documentation. The council can read it. He didn't look at Voss again. He looked at the presiding archivist. I trust the council to complete their review. He sat back. Voss had no more moves. The finding came 2 hours later. It was formal, recorded, and entered into the pack charter under Cale's seal. Seraphine Dravenashvile, daughter of Lyra Dravenashvile, held bloodline standing as a Draven secondary heir under pack law. Her Omega designation was revoked as incorrectly assigned. Her correct designation, confirmed by both bloodline review and trial performance, was Alpha adjacent, the designation held by individuals whose wolf nature operated at the boundary of Alpha class without fitting cleanly within standard hierarchy categories. There was no precedent for it in recent pack history. There was precedent for it, Vale noted quietly to Sarah in the corridor afterward, in the records of 400 years ago. In the history that had been allowed to become obscure. It's not a coincidence, Vale said. The narrowing of the Omega designation over the centuries. The amendments to the charter that removed the Alpha-adjacent category from common knowledge. Someone has been doing maintenance on the ceiling. She looked at Sarah steadily. Making sure no one broke through it. Why? Sarah asked. Because what you are, Vale said, is not the first of your kind. Heron the first one scared from the council that evening. There would be proceedings. Pack law was clear about the falsification of bloodline records. It was one of the oldest statutes, predating the current charter, rooted in the understanding that heritage was the foundation of hierarchy and hierarchy was the foundation of everything. The proceedings would take months and the outcome was not in doubt. Sarah stood at the window of her suite in the early evening and looked at the compound below, the training yards, the servant quarters, the administrative buildings, all of it spread out in the fading light, and thought about 6 years. 6 years of wet hands and gray corridors and eyes that looked past her. 6 years of carrying trays and being invisible and reading in windows and filing things away. 6 years of being somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, in a category that wasn't accurate, living a story that belonged to someone else. She should feel something dramatic. She kept waiting for it. What she actually felt was a kind of clear, quiet anger, not the hot kind, not the kind that wanted to burn things, but the cool, precise, infinitely patient kind. The kind that had been building for 6 years without a proper name for itself. She had a name for it now. Reckoning. There was a knock at the door. Cale. He looked like he hadn't slept. She suspected she didn't either. They stood in the doorway for a moment in the particular silence of two people who have been managing the same crisis from different angles and have arrived, finally, at the same point. There will be repercussions, he said. What happened today will have factions. People who are threatened by the precedent. The charter ruling won't feel stable to everyone who benefited from the old system. I know, Sarah said. It's going to be complicated. More complicated than the last 6 years. He almost smiled. Not quite. But almost. Fair point. You needed grounds, she said. For Article 7. You said that. Yes. How long have you been working toward this? Cale was quiet for a moment. Since my father died, I started reviewing the records and found a gap where there should have been documentation. He paused. Someone had been thorough. But thoroughness takes time and leaves edges, if you know what you're looking for. He looked at her steadily. I found an edge. I followed it. Eventually it led me to a servant girl in the east corridor who was reading military histories and watching ranked wolves train through a laundry window. Sarah looked at him. You were protecting me, she said. Not gratitude, she wasn't ready for gratitude yet, there was too much to process first. Just the fact, stated cleanly. Keeping you hidden while I built grounds for the review, he said. If I'd moved too early without the charter clause invoked correctly, Voss would have had time to disappear the remaining documentation. He paused. I needed you to give me a public act of standing that couldn't be argued with. You used me, she said. Yes, he said, without flinching. With the intention of giving you back something considerably larger than what I used. Silence. I had a choice, Sarah said, slowly. You said today. When I came to you with the information about Voss. You said I had another option now. Yes. You meant I could move against him directly. Make it personal. It would have been understandable. But I didn't. No, Cale said. You made the same choice I would have made. She looked at him, this man who had watched her from a distance for 3 years and built a legal case around her potential and sent her into an arena in a work dress because he needed her to demonstrate something that couldn't be faked. She thought about all the things she still didn't know about him, which was most things. She thought about the pack spread out below the window, fractured along lines that today had made visible, in need of something that she didn't have a word for yet. I want to see the full records, she said. Not just my bloodline. All of it. Everything that was amended, removed, altered. I want to know the shape of it. I can arrange that. And I want to start with the Omega classification history. She held his gaze. Because what was done to me has been done to others. And whatever comes next, that's where I want to start. Cale studied her. That's not going to make you popular, he said. I wasn't popular this morning either, Sarah said. By this afternoon something had changed. Turns out you don't need to be popular. You need to be right, and you need to be willing to prove it. And if the proof takes 6 years. I've done it 6 years before, she said. I know how to be patient. She didn't take the council seat immediately. She spent 3 weeks reading. Every record she could access, every amended charter clause, every administrative change that had quietly narrowed what certain wolves were permitted to claim. She built a map of it in her mind, the shape of the reduction, the pattern of who benefited and when, the specific moments in pack history where the ceiling had been deliberately lowered. It was meticulous work. It was the kind of work that would have been invisible to someone who needed results quickly, who needed the satisfaction of action. Sarah was very comfortable with invisible work. The difference was that now, when she surfaced with conclusions, people had to listen. She took the council seat on a Tuesday morning, 43 days after she'd stood in the arena in a work dress with wet hands and let 3,000 wolves laugh at her name. She sat down at the council table and opened the first document she'd flagged and said, I want to talk about Article 12. The council looked at her. She looked back. We have a problem, she said. And I've been watching it long enough to know exactly how to fix it. No one laughed. They said the trial of the open court was a showcase. A performance. A ceremony dressed up as competition. They were right. It was all of those things. But ceremonies have a way of telling the truth whether they intend to or not. The pack laughed when her name was called. By the final bell, they understood something they couldn't unlearn, that the architecture of power they had been living inside was a choice someone had made, and that choices could be revised. Sarah Dravenashvile revised them. Not with fire. Not with rage. With patience, and knowledge, and the very specific kind of authority that comes from spending 6 years invisible in a world that was never as hidden as it thought it was. She had been watching. And now it was time to be seen. Subscribe. Drop your comments. Like. Share. The story you just heard is only the beginning. If you want to know what Sarah finds in the full charter records, and who else was hiding in plain sight, you know what to do.